They promised freedom for 30 days without sleep. What they created was something far worse than tired soldiers. In a sealed chamber, 5 political prisoners became test subjects for Project Vesna, a Soviet experiment to eliminate humanity's need for rest. But when you strip away sleep, you don't just remove fatigue, you tear down the barriers that keep the human mind intact. By day 15, they were no longer men. They had become something that defied every law of biology, something that could heal faster than bullets could destroy it. The question isn't whether science went too far, it's whether what they unleashed can ever be stopped. The room was as sterile as the inside of a bone, all white tile and cold steel. The only color came from the blood-red star on the uniform of Major Petrov Orlov. He stood with his back ramrod straight, a silver-tipped pointer tracing the intricate pathways of a human brain diagrammed on the wall. His audience was a small team of the nation's finest neurological and biological researchers, their white lab coats a stark contrast to his decorated military green. Among them, sitting slightly straighter than the rest, was Dr. Ivan Morozov. He was young, his face still holding an earnest belief in the purity of science, a belief that was about to be tested to its absolute limit. "Gentlemen," Petrov's voice was like stone grinding on stone, cold and absolute. "Welcome to Project Vesna." He tapped the pointer on the prefrontal cortex. "For decades, our soldiers have been constrained by a biological anchor, the need for sleep, an anchor our enemies share. But war does not sleep, the state does not sleep, progress does not sleep." He paced before them, his footsteps clicking sharply on the tile. Project Vesna, Project Spring, will usher in a new season for the Soviet soldier. An eternal spring of wakefulness. Using a specially designed stimulant gas, a derivative of our own research into nootropics, we will eliminate the need for sleep entirely. A low murmur went through the room. It was the sound of scientific awe mixed with a healthy dose of trepidation. Petrov silenced it with a raised hand. The subjects have been selected. 5 political prisoners, enemies of the state, now given a final opportunity to serve the Union that they so foolishly betrayed. They have been promised their freedom upon successful completion of the 30-day trial. Ivan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He raised a hesitant hand. Petrov's gaze, cold and heavy as a block of granite, fell upon him. "Dr. Morozov, you have a question." "Yes, Major." Ivan cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. "What considerations have been made for the subject's psychological integrity? 30 days without REM sleep, the potential for psychosis is absolute." Petrov did not smile. His expression did not change at all. He lowered the pointer and took a slow step toward Ivan, his eyes boring into the young Dr. S. "Their integrity, Doctor," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, "is a donation to the state. You are here to observe, to document, and to measure the results. Leave the philosophy to the philosophers we have imprisoned." 3 days into the experiment, the ordinary world still held sway within the sealed chamber. Through the thick, two-way mirror of the observation room, Ivan Morozov watched 5 men clinging to the ghosts of their former lives. The air inside the circular room was kept rich with oxygen and laced with the low, steady hiss of the stimulant gas, a sound that was becoming the background music to Ivan's life. The 5 men, promised a pardon for 30 days of wakefulness, were still people. One of them, a poet from Leningrad named Sergei, sat on his cot telling a story about a clever fox outwitting a bear. The other 4 listened, their faces gaunt but still capable of weary smiles. There was a farmer, a university professor, a factory worker, and a chess master who had spoken out against the regime one too many times. They were the flotsam of a political tide, now marooned together in this sterile cage. Ivan watched them on a bank of black and white monitors, his fingers flying across a logbook, meticulously documenting their vitals. Heart rate, respiration, blood pressure, all stable, all within expected parameters. He picked up a microphone connected to a reel-to-reel tape recorder. "Day 3, 14 hours, he dictated, his voice a clinical monotone. Subject 5, Sergei, is engaging in social narrative, a positive sign of maintained cognitive function. Group cohesion remains high. Subjects 4 and 2, the farmer and the professor, discussed their families this morning. Hope is being used as a psychological defense mechanism. He paused, watching as the farmer, a broad-shouldered man named Konstantin, laughed at the punchline of Sergei's story. The sound was thin and distant through the speakers, but it was genuine. For a moment, they were not subjects. They were just men sharing a story. Ivan felt a pang of something he quickly suppressed. It was empathy, a dangerous and unscientific variable. He cleared his throat and continued his dictation, noting their resilience as a baseline from which all future deviation would be measured. He told himself this was a necessary process, a harsh but controlled method for a greater goal. He believed it. He had to. By day 9, the ordinary world had been burned away. The atmosphere in the chamber was sour, thick with the smell of sweat and the unending, low hiss of the gas. The conversations had died first, replaced by muttered whispers that ceased whenever another subject drew too near. Paranoia, slick and oily, had seeped into every corner of the room. The men were skeletal now, their eyes sunk deep into their skulls, ringed with dark, bruised-looking circles. They moved with a twitchy, nervous energy, their bodies buzzing with a chemical fuel that gave them no peace. Ivan watched the monitors, the clinical detachment he had cultivated beginning to fray. He saw Konstantin, the farmer, corner the poet Sergei against the wall. His whispers were venomous, audible even through the tinny speakers. "You watch me," Konstantin hissed, his voice raspy. "You write things down when I sleep, what little I do. You are one of them, an informant." Sergei, frail and exhausted, shook his head. "No, Konstantin, I swear," the farmer shoved him. It was a clumsy, weak scuffle, over in seconds, but it was a rupture, the last thread of their shared humanity snapping. Ivan logged the event, his hand tight around the pen. Day 9, 21:30 hours. Onset of predictable paranoia. Subject 4 exhibited aggression towards Subject 5, based on delusional belief structures. Group cohesion has collapsed. He commanded one of the cameras to zoom in, not on the argument, but on Sergei S. hands. The poet was sitting on his cot, his back turned to the room, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He was trying to steady them by clenching them into fists, but the tremors just shook his entire arms. Ivan watched the screen, his own hand perfectly still, and felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the official predictions. The science was working, the subjects were breaking, right on schedule, and it was the most horrifying thing he had ever seen. Later that night, Ivan sat at the small, metal desk in his Spartan quarters. The only personal item in the room was a worn, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with his precise clinical handwriting. He wrote, documenting the day's events, the scuffle, the escalating paranoia, the physiological decay. But as he wrote, the dispassionate language of science failed him. The neat script grew heavier, the words more troubled. Petrov sees only the result, he wrote, the nib of his pen scratching angrily at the paper. He sees a soldier who does not tire. But the process is unraveling them thread by thread. It is not just the mind that frays, it is the soul. We are documenting the deconstruction of 5 men. He paused, staring at the words. They seemed inadequate, a pale shadow of the raw horror he witnessed on the monitors. He thought of Sergei's trembling hands, of the vacant, haunted look in the professor's eyes. He wrote one final line. Can a man be unraveled and then knitted back together? He closed the journal. The only sound in the room was the low, constant hiss of the ventilation system, a sterile metal serpent breathing its anesthetic whisper through the walls. It was the same sound he heard in the observation room, the same sound that filled the chamber next door, the sound of the gas, the sound of men being undone. He stared at the wall, and for the first time, he wondered if they were observing the experiment or if they were all, in fact, inside of it. By day 15, the chamber was no longer a laboratory. It was a cage of low-level madness, a canvas painted with filth and despair. The neat predictions in Ivan Morozov's logbooks had become a mockery. Science had provided a map, but the subjects had wandered off into a terrifying, uncharted wilderness of the mind. And then the screaming started. It came from Konstantin, the farmer. He stood in the center of the room, his back rigid, his head thrown back, and unleashed a sound that had no place in a human throat. It wasn't a yell for help or a cry of pain. It was a continuous, high-pitched, inhuman shriek, thin and sharp as a shard of glass, a signal broadcast from some collapsed part of his soul. It went on and on, without pause for breath, a physical impossibility. Ivan and another researcher, a stout man named Boris, watched from the observation room, their hands clapped over their own ears. The sound drilled into their skulls, vibrating in their teeth. But the most horrifying part was not the scream itself. It was the reaction of the other 4 subjects. They didn't react at all. They simply huddled in their corners, rocking back and forth, occasionally glancing at Konstantin with a placid, almost bored detachment, as if his auditory agony was no more significant than the constant hiss of the gas. The screaming continued for 3 solid hours. Ivan timed it. 3 hours, a feat of respiratory endurance that should have torn a man's lungs to shreds. Finally, Konstantin's voice shredded. The shriek cracked, descended into a wet, gurgling rasp, and then vanished. But he did not stop. His mouth remained wide open, his body convulsing with the silent, rhythmic effort of the scream he could no longer produce. He was a statue of an unending torment, and the scientific framework, the neat columns of predictable psychosis, had utterly and completely failed. This was not on the map. This was an anomaly, and it was a terrifying new crack in the foundation of Ivan's ordered world. 3 days later, on day 18th, the subjects did something new. It began with a strange rhythmic tearing sound. Ivan, watching the monitors, saw the poet, Sergei, ripping pages from the thin books they'd been provided. One by one, the others joined him. They moved with a shared, unspoken purpose, a pack of wolves working in silent tandem. They took the shredded paper, mixed it with their own filth, and began to plaster the foul concoction over the inside of the two-way mirror. It was a deliberate, methodical act. They were building a wall between their world and the world of their observers. They were willingly, knowingly, blinding the eyes of science. Within an hour, the window was completely covered in a smear of brown and grey, and the researchers were left with nothing but their audio feeds and 5 darkened screens. They were blind. The sounds that came from the chamber changed. The tearing stopped, replaced by a low, guttural chanting. It wasn't a language Ivan could recognize. It was a series of deep, resonant tones that seemed to rise from the chest, more animal than human. It was the sound of a new and terrible ritual being born in the darkness. Ivan stood before the blank monitors, listening to the disembodied chanting, and a cold realization washed over him. The subjects were no longer 5 broken individuals. They were a single, unified, and hostile entity, acting with a chilling new intelligence. And they had just declared war. That night, Ivan's composure finally broke. He stormed into Major Petrov's office without knocking, his lab coat stained, his eyes wild. "You have to stop this," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Major, they are not just psychotic. The screaming, the chanting, they covered the mirror. It is not in any of the literature." Petrov sat behind his vast mahogany desk, unmoved. He was cleaning a pair of spectacles with a silk cloth, his movements slow and precise. He did not even look up. "Calm yourself, doctor. Hysteria is not a scientific variable." "This isn't hysteria!" Ivan slammed his hands on the desk. "This is an atrocity. We are not observing them anymore. We are creating something. Something inhuman! Petrov set his glasses down. He looked at Ivan, and for the first time, there was something other than cold dismissal in his eyes. It was a flicker of dark, predatory amusement. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a different file, one Ivan had never seen before. It was bound in red leather and marked with the single, embossed star of the highest state classification. He slid it across the desk. "Doctor," he said, his voice a silky whisper. "The goal was never just wakefulness. That was a convenient fiction for men like you, men who need to believe in a noble purpose." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "The true goal is to create a soldier who does not feel pain, who does not feel fear, who does not feel regret or love or anything but the will of the state." He allowed himself a thin, bloodless smile. "From what you tell me, Doctor, it appears we are succeeding beyond our wildest dreams." Ivan stared at the red file, then at Petrov's smiling face, and he felt the floor drop out from under him. He was not a scientist in an experiment. He was a priest in a black mass, and he had just learned the true name of the god he was serving. Back in his lab on the night of day 20, Ivan worked with the feverish energy of a man trying to solve his own damnation. He had been locked out of the observation room since his outburst. All he had was the last data stream, recorded just before the subjects had covered the mirror. He fed the numbers into the facility's primitive computer, a clunky machine that filled half the room, and ran a simulation of their biological state. The machine whirred and clicked and then crashed. He rebooted it, checked the parameters, and ran it again. It crashed again, this time spitting out a sheet of paper filled with nonsensical symbols. He stared at the vital signs on his chart. They were impossible. Metabolic rates had tripled, suggesting their bodies were burning fuel like a furnace, yet their core temperatures were dropping. They should have been burning alive with fever, but they were growing cold. He mumbled to himself, pacing the lab. "It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. They should be dead. Simple starvation, cellular decay, nutrient consumption. They should be corpses by now." His eyes fell upon a slide tray. It contained a blood sample taken from Sergei on day 1, a baseline of his humanity. Ivan put it under his microscope, looking at the healthy, normal cells. Then he looked back at the impossible numbers from the simulation. Heat without fire, energy without fuel, life without the biological requirements for life. And as he stood there, torn between the sterile reality of the microscope and the madness of the data, a horrifying new hypothesis began to dawn in the dark corners of his mind. A hypothesis that had nothing to do with psychosis and everything to do with biology. Reason was leading him down a path to an utterly unreasonable conclusion. He was beginning to suspect that the gas hadn't just broken their minds, it was rewriting the very laws of their bodies. For 2 days, Ivan Morozov's horrifying new hypothesis festered in the silence. The theory that the stimulant gas was not a key, but a hammer, shattering the very vessel of human biology, rewriting it into something new. He had presented his preliminary findings, the impossible metabolic rates, the crashing simulations to Petrov, who had dismissed them as data corruption, a symptom of Ivan's own fraying nerves. And then, on day 21, the chamber went silent. The chanting stopped, the whispers stopped. The 24-hour audio feed became a flat, dead line of pure static. The microphones had been destroyed. On day 22, a tense group gathered before the thick steel door of the containment chamber. Major Petrov stood at the front, flanked by 2 heavily armed guards. He had summoned Ivan, whose presence was a reluctant, silent accusation. "The gas supply will run out in 8 days, Petrov stated, his voice a bastion of calm in the sea of tension. "We will see what is left of them then. Patience, gentlemen." But the silence was a living thing. It pressed in on them, heavy and unnatural. One of the guards, A weary, middle-aged man named Dmitri shifted his weight, his eyes locked on the door. "Major," he whispered, his voice tight. "It's not a natural quiet. It's listening." Petrov shot him a look of pure contempt. "Control your peasant superstitions, Sergeant." As the word left his lips, a sound came from within the chamber. It was not a scream or a bang. It was a loud, wet, sickening thump. A sound like a side of beef being dropped from a great height onto a concrete floor. It echoed through the steel of the door, vibrating under their feet. Then, once again, absolute silence. The guards flinched. Ivan felt his blood run cold. Even Petrov's composure finally cracked. He stared at the door, his jaw tight. The unknown, the thing he could not measure or command, was now demanding to be seen. "Open it," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "Open it now." The bolts on the heavy door groaned in protest as they were withdrawn. The moment the seal was broken, the stench hit them like a physical blow. It was the coppery smell of old blood and the sharp, chemical tang of ammonia, a smell of butchery and decay. Armed with rifles and flashlights, the two guards, Petrov and a trembling Ivan, stepped inside. The scene was a charnel house, a nightmare rendered in blood and bone. The fifth prisoner, the poet Sergei, lay dead in the center of the room. He had been brutally disemboweled, his organs ripped from his body. Chunks of his own flesh had been torn off and methodically stuffed into the floor drains, a deliberate act of horrific plumbing. Ivan gagged, stumbling back, his scientific mind shutting down in the face of such primordial horror. Across the room, huddled in a corner where the single light bulb cast long, dancing shadows, stood the four remaining subjects. They were no longer men. They were skeletal, emaciated to the point of impossibility, yet their frames were corded with thick, dense muscle that shifted under their waxy, translucent skin. They were living paradoxes of decay and power. As one, they turned their heads to face the intruders. The movement was not human. It was a perfect, synchronized motion, like four marionettes pulled by a single, invisible string. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, were solid black pools of dilated pupils, devoid of reason, of recognition, of anything but a profound and terrifying emptiness. Science had set out to create a tireless soldier. Instead, it had opened a doorway to hell and invited its occupants to step through. One of the guards, a young man no older than Ivan, let out a choked gasp and raised his rifle. It was the last mistake he would ever make. Before he could fire, one of the creatures lunged. It didn't run. It moved in a fluid, impossibly fast, low to the ground scuttling motion, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. It crossed the 10 meters of the room in the space of a heartbeat, a pale blur of speed and intent. The creature slammed into the guard with the force of a battering ram. The man's scream cut short by a sickening crunch of bone. It tore the rifle from his hands as if it were a child's toy and then, with a horrifying, deliberate motion, ripped his throat out with its teeth. The other three creatures did not move. They merely watched, their black eyes placid, as if observing a demonstration. "Fire! Fire!" Petrov shrieked, his voice cracking with terror. The remaining guard, Dmitri, opened fire. The roar of the automatic rifle was deafening in the enclosed space, but the bullets that would have torn a man apart seemed to have little effect on the creature. It barely flinched as the rounds punched into its dense flesh. It dropped the dead guard and launched itself at Dmitri. It was a scene of pure chaos. Ivan and Petrov scrambled backward out of the doorway, falling over each other in their panic. Petrov, screaming orders that no one could follow, fumbled for the door controls. With a hydraulic hiss, the heavy steel door began to slam shut, sealing the brave and terrified Dmitri inside with the things. His final, agonized scream was cut short by the final, deafening boom of the door locking into place. Trembling, spattered with the blood of the guard who had died beside him, Ivan Morozov stared into the eyepiece of his microscope. He had done it without thinking. In the chaos of the retreat, as Petrov had screamed for the door to be sealed, Ivan had seen Sergei's body. He had lunged, swiped a sample of congealing blood from the floor, and fled. It was a purely scientific reflex in the face of absolute terror. Now, in the sterile quiet of his lab, he saw the truth. His hypothesis had been tragically, horrifyingly correct. He adjusted the focus, his hands shaking so badly he could barely turn the knob. There, on the slide, he saw it clearly. He saw it. The complex carbon molecules of the stimulant gas were not merely floating in the bloodstream. They had invaded the cells themselves. They had bonded with the mitochondrial DNA, forming a new, terrifying symbiosis. The gas had become a part of them. The mitochondria, the powerhouses of the cell, were now working at a fantastic, cancerous rate. The cells were not decaying. They were aggressively, violently self-repairing. They were consuming the body's own fat, muscle, and bone as raw fuel for a constant, unending process of regeneration. That was why they were skeletal, yet strong. That was why bullets barely slowed them. Their bodies were healing faster than they could be destroyed. Ivan leaned back from the microscope, a single, horrifying thought crystallizing in his mind, clear and sharp as a shard of ice. He whispered it aloud to the empty room, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. They don't need sleep because they never stop healing. They are not dying. They are evolving. For 4 days, the sealed chamber remained a tomb, and Ivan Morozov lived in the cold, sterile light of his lab, a ghost haunted by a truth he could not share. His discovery about the subject's regenerative biology was a piece of forbidden knowledge, a scientific heresy that explained the horror, but offered no comfort. He worked, fueled by coffee, and a terror that had burned past fear into a state of pure, intellectual focus. The facility outside his lab was a pressure cooker of whispers and armed patrols, but Ivan was in his own world, a world of cellular biology and monstrous possibilities. Then, on the morning of day 26, the voice of Major Petrov echoed from every intercom speaker in the facility, a voice of brutal, absolute authority attempting to mask a thinly veiled panic. "Attention! All personnel," the voice crackled, devoid of warmth. "Project Vesna is hereby declared a catastrophic failure. By my authority, I am enacting the Scythe Protocol, effective immediately." Ivan looked up from his chalkboard of frantic equations, listening. All research notes, data logs, and project materials are to be incinerated. All non-essential staff will be confined to quarters until further notice. The West Wing is under full military lockdown. Petrov paused, and the hiss of the open channel filled the silence. The experimental subjects have been compromised beyond recovery. At 8 sound hours tomorrow, the Chamber S ventilation system will be flooded with military-grade neurotoxin CX-9. The subjects will be neutralized, and this event will be erased from history. There will be no questions. There will be no discussion. That is all. The intercom clicked off, leaving behind a silence more menacing than the announcement itself. Ivan stared at the speaker on the wall. Erased. Petrov was going to bury his failure in a mass grave and pour poison on top of it. But Ivan knew something the Major did not. Poison wouldn't work. That night, Ivan's lab was a whirlwind of frantic energy. He was a man possessed, pulling dusty books on enzymology and advanced cellular biology from his shelves, their pages flying as he searched for an answer. Petrov's plan was useless, a fool's errand. A neurotoxin attacks the nervous system. But how do you poison a body that heals faster than the poison can act? The subject's regenerative abilities, their horrific cancerous gift, would simply metabolize the toxin, purge it, and continue their terrible evolution. "No, no, no," he muttered, scribbling furiously on a chalkboard, the white dust coating his hands. He was mapping the molecular structure of the gas, the elegant chain of carbon atoms that had become a key to unlocking biological hell. If a key had locked the door, then a different key could unlock it. Not poison, a specific targeted weapon. His mind raced. "A breaker," he whispered, the idea striking him with the force of a physical blow. "An enzyme. something that can target the bond, the specific symbiotic link between the gas and the mitochondria, something that doesn't just kill the cell, but tells it to kill itself, a cascade of catastrophic failure. He began to sketch the complex protein chain. It was possible. Theoretically, it was brilliant. But a theory required testing. It required data from a living subject. And to get that, he needed a fresh sample, a live tissue sample. His eyes darted toward the door, his mind already racing down the cold, dark corridors of the West Wing. He had to get back into that room. He had to face the monsters he helped create, one more time. He found Dmitri, the surviving guard, huddled in a small security nexus near the sealed-off wing. The man was a wreck, his face pale and clammy, his hands shaking as he took long pulls from a bottle of cheap vodka. The air smelled of alcohol and fear. "Dmitri," Ivan said, his voice low and urgent. The guard jumped, splashing vodka on his uniform. He stared at Ivan with wide, haunted eyes. "Doctor, you should be in your quarters. It's over. We just have to wait for the morning." "It's not over," Ivan said, stepping closer. "Petrov's neurotoxin won't work. It won't even slow them down. I've seen their biology. They will survive it." Dmitri just shook his head, taking another drink. "Then nothing can be done. Those things, they are not men. They are devils. I know they're not men." Ivan grabbed the guard's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. The obsessive fire in his eyes made Dmitri flinch. "They are a disease, a plague, and I am the only one who knows how to write the cure. But I need to get a sample. One more sample from a living subject." He laid out his plan. Override the Scythe protocol's poison pumps from this terminal, reroute the lines, and flood the chamber with a massive concentrated dose of surgical anesthetic instead. It wouldn't kill them, but it might knock them out for a few precious minutes. A window, that's all he needed. Dmitri pulled his arm away, terrified. "You are insane. Go in there with them? After what they did? Listen to me." Ivan's voice was a harsh whisper. "In a few hours, Petrov will try his poison and fail. And when he does, those things will still be in there, stronger than ever, and still trying to get out. My way is the only chance we have. The only chance this entire facility has. Help me." Dmitri stared at the doctor's wild, intense face. He saw a man who had gone far beyond the edge of reason, but he also saw a glimmer of hope in his madness. It was a terrifying choice, to trust the devils you knew, or the madman who claimed he could kill them. Slowly, reluctantly, with a trembling hand, Dmitri turned to the control panel. On the night of day 28th, hunched in the dim light of the security nexus, Ivan and Dmitri watched a grainy, flickering image on the single monitor that was still connected to the chamber. The anesthetic was ready, waiting for Ivan's command. But what they saw on the screen froze the blood in their veins. The four creatures were not idle. They were not raging, they were working. With chilling, silent intelligence, they were using the long, sturdy femurs of the dead guards as levers. They had found a structural seam in the chamber's reinforced concrete wall and were prying at it, working together. One of them, taller than the others, a clear alpha, directed the group with subtle, sharp gestures of its head and hands. There was no sound but the low, rhythmic grunting of their efforts and another, more terrible noise that came through the audio feed. It was a low, grating, metallic groan. The sound of stressed metal. The sound of a cage about to break. Ivan stared, his scientific mind reeling from the implications. This wasn't mindless savagery. This was cooperative pack behavior, tool use, problem solving. They were not just monsters. They were an intelligent, organized enemy, and they were about to break free. The grinding groan of stressed metal became a high-pitched shriek. "Now, Dmitri! Now!" Ivan Morozov yelled, his voice tight with adrenaline. In the security nexus, the terrified guard slammed his hand down on a large red button. With a deep, powerful hiss, thick white clouds of concentrated anesthetic gas began to billow into the containment chamber. On the monitor, 3 of the creatures reeled as the gas hit them, their coordinated movements dissolving into a clumsy stagger before they slumped to the floor, unconscious. But the fourth, the Alpha, remained standing. It braced itself against the wall, its skeletal frame shuddering, its head low. It was fighting. "It's not enough," Dmitri stammered. "It's not working on him." "It's enough for a window," Ivan said, pulling a heavy rebreather mask over his face. In his gloved hand, he held a single, large syringe filled with a clear, shimmering liquid. The breaker enzyme. His cure. His plague. He sealed the mask and nodded to Dmitri. "Pray for me, Sergeant." Ivan didn't wait for an answer. He ran down the corridor to the secondary airlock, the syringe clutched in his hand like a holy relic. The inner door hissed open, and he stepped into the cold, gas-filled chamber. He was a scientist entering his laboratory, a priest entering a desecrated temple. The Alpha creature slowly lifted its head, its black, empty eyes fixing on him. It swayed on its feet, but its gaze was perfectly steady. It had been waiting for him. As Ivan took a cautious step forward, a voice bloomed inside his mind. It was not a sound. It was a thought, an idea, placed there with the invasive intimacy of a surgeon's scalpel. It was dry, ancient, and utterly calm. "We are not sick, Doctor. We are free." Ivan froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. The creature's mouth did not move. It simply stared at him, its gaze peeling back the layers of his consciousness. Sleep is the cage your brain builds around the infinite, a nightly retreat from the terror of true awareness. We have broken the lock. The gas was not a poison. It was a key. The voice knew him. It sifted through his memories with a cold, dispassionate curiosity. It found his fear of failure, the constant gnawing shadow of his father's disapproval, his desperate, lonely ambition. You seek to understand. It is the only thing you have ever truly wanted. You tear things apart to see how they work. You map the body and the mind, but you are still in the cage, looking at the shadows on the wall. We can show you. We can give you the answer to the question you have spent your life asking. Be free with us, Ivan Morozov. It was the ultimate temptation. Not power, not wealth, but knowledge. Pure, unfiltered, forbidden knowledge. To see the universe without the biological shackles of humanity. The scientist in him screamed to accept, to take the final step, to see what lay beyond the veil. For a second, he lowered the syringe, captivated by the promise. It was not an antithesis to his science. It was the horrifying ultimate synthesis, a consciousness made manifest by a chemical he had helped create. A massive, deafening boom tore through the facility as the weakened chamber wall finally gave way. A cloud of concrete dust and twisted rebar exploded into the corridor. The shockwave and the sudden rush of fresh air jolted the three unconscious creatures on the floor. Their eyes snapped open. With a unified, unholy shriek, they scrambled to their feet and poured through the breach, a tide of pale flesh and murderous intent. Immediately, the corridor erupted in the deafening roar of automatic rifle fire. Alarms blared, their klaxons a frantic counterpoint to the screams of men and the guttural snarls of the creatures. Through the swirling dust, Ivan could see the muzzle flashes of Petrov's security team as they opened fire on the things emerging from the smoke. The breakout had begun. The ultimate danger was unleashed. Inside the chamber, the Alpha creature turned its head slowly toward the sounds of battle. The voice in Ivan's mind was now tinged with something like disappointment. A master turning away from a failed student. The old world dies so loudly, it whispered in his head. They cannot see. They can only fight. It took a single, fluid step toward the breach, its attention now on the conflict outside, ignoring Ivan completely. This was it. This was his chance. The temptation of knowledge warred with the horrific reality of the carnage in the hallway. The scientist warred with the doctor. He made his choice. He chose the lesser of two horrors. He surrendered to the terrible necessity of his purpose. With a desperate cry torn from his own throat, Ivan lunged forward. He slammed the needle deep into the creature's corded neck, his thumb depressing the plunger with all his might. emptying the full contents of the breaker enzyme into its alien biology. The alpha creature convulsed. The psychic voice in Ivan's head became a silent, deafening shriek of pure agony. For the first time, a sound tore from its physical mouth, a high-pitched, piercing wail that was part animal, part machine. Its body began to melt. The enzyme was working, triggering a catastrophic, cascading cellular failure. Its flesh blackened and sloughed off its bones, its form dissolving into a bubbling, steaming pool of liquefied biomass right before his eyes. Ivan stumbled backward out of the ruined chamber, ripping off his rebreather and gasping for air. The battle in the corridor was over. The scene was one of mutual, absolute destruction. The three other creatures lay dead, their bodies riddled with hundreds of bullets. Petrov's last two guards were also dead, torn to pieces. Across the blood-soaked floor, Major Petrov stood alone, a pistol smoking in his hand, his uniform shredded, his face a mask of shock. He stared at Ivan, then at the hissing, bubbling puddle on the floor that had once been the Alpha. Ivan Morozov looked back, his eyes hollowed out, his idealism burned away to ash. The fire of his scientific curiosity was extinguished, replaced by the cold, dead weight of what he had done. He had not healed. He had not explored. He had created a weapon to unmake life itself. He was a man who had looked into the abyss and learned, with terrifying precision, how to build a bigger one. What a chilling story. It is one of those tales that sticks with you, not just because of the visceral horror, but because of the deeply unsettling question at its core. On one hand, everything that happens feels ancient and superstitious. The guard, Dmitri, calls the creatures devils, and in a way, he's right. They form a silent hive mind. They seem to possess impossible strength, and their leader even communicates through telepathy. It is like a folktale about a curse or a demonic possession brought to life in the cold walls of a laboratory. But on the other hand, the story gives us a terrifyingly complete scientific answer for everything. Dr. Morozov doesn't just witness the horror, he explains it. He finds the cause in mitochondrial DNA and cellular regeneration. The science isn't a comfort. It doesn't make the horror safe or understandable. In fact, it makes it worse. The story's true terror isn't that monsters exist. It's that they can be built. Morozov doesn't debunk the superstition. He proves it with a microscope. So that leaves me with a question for you. Which is ultimately more frightening? A monster that breaks the rules of our world, or the realization that the rules of our world actually allow for such monsters to be made? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.